There are so many ways we can begin when talking about the strange entity that is the American literary magazine. We can start at the beginning, or one of the beginnings, with some of the journals that have been around for the longest, but then we might need to stop and wrangle over how to start this counting. Do we begin with the North American Review, first published in 1815 and still publishing today, but with a gap of around 14 years between 1940 and 1964? Or do we begin with Chicago's own poetry magazine, which began in 1912 and is the nation's longest continuously running poetry journal, and also the oldest American journal that's dedicated to poetry? Or do we pick our favorite between the Yale Review, which first saw print in 1819, but under the masthead of its previous name, the Christian Spectator, and that eminent Southern journal, which didn't begin until 1892, the same year the Yale Review changed its name, but has never gone by any other name but the Sewanee Review? Or might we begin with the Double Dealer, the magazine that in 1922 published Hemingway for the first time, and so played a huge role in changing the nature of narrative prose itself? Or might we look to the Little Review, another Chicago original and product of the professional and intimate collaboration between Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap, famous for not only its championing of high modernist experiment, but also because it was the little journal that was shut down on obscenity charges after publishing installments of James Joyce's Ulysses. Or we could start with the Paris Review, the journal that invented the author interview as we know it today. Or with New World Writing, the first lit mag to publish with a perfect binding that bound book form that we recognize as the shape of most print journals today. Or we might jump ahead to the present at the nowest of the now and look at what's probably the most curious of the contemporary journals, the one that's consistently trying to break away from traditional forms of the book. I'm talking, of course, about Timothy McSweeney's Quarterly Concern, or just McSweeney's, and all of its offshoots, the leaders of a pack in an era of contemporary publishing that changed the game in terms of voice and form. Or we might look at all the ways literary journals are really hybrid entities collaborating across visual, oral, and political realms, such as the beautiful and scathing contemporary journal Witness, which has a documentary edge to it, or the transgenre reach of another journal created in Chicago, Columbia College's Hotel America. Or we might look to long-standing journals like the Threepenny Review, which publishes poetry on plain newsprint in the hopes that the bells and whistles of design don't get in the way of the language they seek to serve. Wherever we begin, we can depend on a few common ideas that have held up more or less over time, having to do with the many kinds of journals that exist and how those journals interact with social and literary change. Some of those categories that journals have long kind of identified with have been, poetry, leftist, regional, experimental, critical, eclectic. I would add, in today's world, probably replacing the idea of a regional journal that really sticks to the region in which they live. I would probably expand that to to other kinds of themes, other kinds of parameters such as place, gender, sexuality, race, music, jazz, food, fiction, nonfiction. Reaching back to the little magazines of the early 20th century, which was a heyday of magazine form that forms the basis of much of how we talk about literary journals today. We can find journals that fit into all of these general categories. The journal Others, for instance, was a poetry journal, has echoes today in journals such as Poetry East, the poetry dedicated journal that's published uh, out of DePaul. We can look back to the Anvil, a leftist journal edited by Jack Conroy, and its echoes today are journals such as Guernica. We can look at journals such as Prairie Schooner, although we don't really need to be thinking about echoes of Prairie Schooner because it's still publishing, but it began as a regionally identified journal coming out of the Western Prairie. It's known as an international journal today, but other journals still carry that regional tone. Waterstone Review, Third Coast Review, both in the Midwest, Curbside Splendor in Chicago, although most regionally identified journals tend to reach out to authors beyond their journal parameters, and the regional identity tends to be more about aesthetic than the identity of the authors. And we might argue that instead of region as a theme, some of these other thematic ideas have taken place in terms of, well, place itself. Journals like Ecotone and Terrain, or subject-focused journals such as Chicago's Gray's magazine, which focuses on food, or identity-based journals, LGBT or multicultural journals such as Sinister Wisdom or Mosaic, that we're going to be talking about later in this course. Reaching back into the early 20th century again, we find experimental journals like Broom, which has echoes today in magazines like Fence and Pank. And we can look back to the famous journal Dial as one of the early instances of literary magazines with a deep critical focus. If you look at the bylines in Dial, you'll see many of the authors that are published in many other of the journals of its time, but also you'll find authors who later ended up becoming editors of other journals. Contemporary echoes are journals like the Southern Humanities Review, Salem and Gundy, even perhaps journals like the Georgia Review, which are probably more eclectic overall in focus, but have a very strong critical voice. And of course, most journals today probably fit best under that eclectic umbrella, such as the Seven Arts did back in the early 20th century. Today's echoes, well, the list is endless, but we can include the Missouri Review, the Mississippi Review, the Indiana Review, and why not throw on DePaul's Crook and Folly to that list, in that it's a journal that has no stated aesthetic, but instead is interested in publishing good writing that crosses all barriers. Journals almost always begin because there's an editor or a group of editors or a group of writers who want to be editors, who have a desire to fill what they perceive as a gap in the literary scene within which they're living. Journals certainly launched careers, and there's many, many stories of of little unknown journals that that published some writer who turned out to be one of the best known writers of our time, such as uh, the story about Hemingway we mentioned earlier. Uh, but just as often, journals exist to create homes for writers and writing, work, and artists who are in search of each other's company and community. So it's useful to think about journals as neighborhoods as well as individual aesthetics. This journal, the Yardbird Reader, was one of the first multicultural journals. The editor of this first issue was Ishmael Reed. The editor of one of the later issues was Frank Chin. Um, Writers who were to become very important names in their time, but at this point created this journal in order to publish work that wasn't getting published elsewhere. The other common denominator of literary magazines, whether they are the most successful of our day or loved and known by a very few, uh, is that they are always labors of somebody's love. I mean, the comparison here between Tin House and Versal, for instance, if you look at the names on the cover of this current issue of Tin House, Stephen King, Cheryl Strayed, uh, uh, both writers who are likely to be household names. And on the other end of that spectrum, you have a journal like Versal that's very interested in paper arts and a minimalist, beautiful design. Uh, both sides of the spectrum, some of the most popular work of our time, and tiny, beautiful projects that may never make a dime, both the labor of some editors' love. Thus, the quotation I used for the flag of this class from Rob Spillman, who is the founding editor of Tin House: "There will always be idealists and happy fools, so there will always be literary magazines." Uh, I want you to keep this idea in mind as we go forth in this class. I want you to be thinking about what your literary idealism is and what your happy foolishness is, because those are the pathways into your voice and aesthetic and vision. Uh, it will be from that base that you can be led to the idea that might be the journal that can be the home of the next crew of voices that we haven't heard yet. I look forward to hearing your uh, additions to the conversation.